This morning was no different from any other. A light breeze ruffled the branches of the old oak tree by the window, and sunlight streamed through the curtains, flooding the room with warm light. Desmond, a 16-year-old with kind eyes and slightly disheveled curls, lazily pulled on his worn sneakers. A normal day was ahead of him. A morning run in the neighborhood park, some music in his headphones, and maybe a meeting with friends. His house stood on a quiet street where life flowed calmly and measuredly. People said hello over the fences, smiled at passersby, but stayed in their own small, cozy universe. His place had always seemed to him both boring and safe at the same time. He wore his old Stay Kind t-shirt, the one his grandmother had once given him. She had often said, "Kindness is the key to everything." Desmond wasn't sure it was true, but he loved that phrase as much as he loved his grandmother's hugs. As he stepped into the street, something unusual caught his attention. An elderly man was standing on the opposite side of the road. He was trying to lift a large box, but his movements were awkward, and he was clearly struggling with the weight. Desmond stopped. For a moment, he thought that someone else, older, would notice the old man and help him, but the people passing by only gave him quick glances as they went about their business. After hesitating for a second, the teenager took off his headphones, slipped them into his pocket, and confidently walked toward the old man. "Hey, can I help you?" he asked, smiling slightly. The older man raised his head. His face was tired, but there was relief in his eyes. "That would be very kind," he exhaled gratefully. Desmond stepped closer, and without waiting for instructions, easily picked up the box. It was much heavier than he'd expected, but the teenager tried not to show it. "What have you got there? Stones?" he joked, trying to lift the box a little higher. The old man smiled. "Almost. These are old books. I decided to donate them to the library, but I guess I overestimated my strength." "Books are cool," Desmond said, carefully lowering the box into the trunk. "But next time, you'll definitely need a helper." "And I think I've already found him," the old man replied, with warmth in his voice. When the work was done, the man thanked Desmond, but the teenager just waved his hand, saying, "It's nothing." He didn't even recognize the old man's name, just nodded slightly and returned to his morning route. But something about that moment stayed with him. It was a strange, pleasant sensation, like he had done something more than just pick up a box. He didn't yet know that this day would be the beginning of an amazing story that would change his career to life. Desmond wasn't the kind of man who liked to draw attention to himself. He liked to watch the world from the shadows. But today, he couldn't pass by, even from afar. He noticed an elderly man bent over trying to lift a huge box standing on the sidewalk. His movements were clumsy, his hands trembling with effort, and there wasn't a soul around to help. The teenager could have just continued on his way. Someone else would probably have done just that. But his grandmother's words flashed through his mind. "Always help if you can, even if no one asks you to." Those words sounded so clear, as if she were standing right next to him. Desmond crossed the road with a quick step. He didn't think about how it looked from the outside. He didn't care what anyone else had to say. "Good morning," he began, stepping closer. "Can I help you?" The man, apparently too focused on his task, didn't notice him at first. When he heard the voice, he flinched and raised his head. His gaze was tired but surprised at the same time. It wasn't every day that a teenager on the street offered help for nothing. Yes, thank you, the old man replied, a little confused, wiping the sweat from his forehead. This box, it's heavier than I thought it would be. Desmond, wasting no time, moved closer and tried to lift it. As soon as he grasped the edges, it was clear why the old man was having such a hard time. The weight of the box was heavy, as if there were bricks inside. Wow, you're not kidding, he said, grinning. What did you put in it? Old books, the man explained, slightly embarrassed. I decided to donate them to the local library. I've got them just gathering dust anyway. That's a cool idea, Desmond said, struggling to lift the box. But I don't think I can carry that thing alone. The man seemed to feel embarrassed at his helplessness. Thanks for stopping. People are mostly in a hurry these days. Nobody notices the little things. It's no small thing, Desmond answered, looking around to open the trunk. If I were you, I'd be hoping for help too. There was not a trace of arrogance in his voice, not a hint of pride in his deed. It was said in a simple, human way. The teenager carefully lowered the box into the trunk, careful not to drop it. The man looked at him gratefully, his gaze warmer than his words. I don't even know how to thank you, he murmured, running his hand through his gray hair. You don't need anything. Desmond waved it off, smiling again. I'm just glad I could help. The man stared at him intently, as if memorizing his facial features so he wouldn't forget. It's not often you meet someone like you, he said quietly. Desmond felt a little embarrassed. He nodded, lowering his gaze to his sneakers. He didn't feel like talking much, and there wasn't much time. His morning route was still waiting. Well, I'm off. Have a good day. With these words, he turned and walked on, putting the headphones back in his ears. But the music was not distracting him at that moment. Was he thinking about the old man? Probably. Did he think this incident would become important? Hardly. And yet, something warm remained inside, as if this moment was significant, not only to the old man, but to himself. But Desmond couldn't even imagine that something much bigger lay ahead of him. Desmond closed the trunk with satisfaction, wiping his palms on his jeans. The box was finally in place, and the old man looked visibly relieved, but instead of thanking him and driving away, he stood there as if he wanted to say something. You should probably be busy by now, the man began, clearing his throat. But you know it's rare to meet someone who'll just offer to help, especially young people. Desmond grinned, taking no offense at the words. I just thought you might have gotten a kick out of it, he replied easily. It's no big deal. The old man looked at him with interest. What's your name? Desmond, the teen answered, adjusting the headphones that hung around his neck. And you are? My name is Mr. Harper, the old man said, extending her his hand. Desmond shook it, surprised at the firm handshake despite the man's age. Nice to meet you, Mr. Harper. What were you doing outside so early? It's not often you meet teenagers who aren't in bed at this hour. Running. Well, trying to run, Desmond admitted, smiling, a little embarrassed. I do it for myself. Helps clear my head. Mr. Harper nodded, humming approvingly. That's a good habit. I wish I had that when I was your age. Now I'm carrying boxes instead of running around. Desmond laughed, and the old man seemed to feel a little lighter too. What are the books in the box? The teenager asked, nodding at the trunk. Mr. Harper thought for a moment, his gaze becoming a little detached, as if he had gone back in time. These are my wife's books. She loved them, collected them over the years, with love. When she passed away, I thought I could keep them for myself. But he paused, exhaling quietly. I realized it was better to give them to someone who would use them. That's what she'd want. Mr. Harper's words sounded simple, but they had depth. Desmond was silent for a moment, unsure of what to say. I'm sorry, and I didn't know, he finally said, his voice a little quieter. It's all right, son, the old man said, looking up. You didn't know, but you helped anyway. That says a lot about you. Desmond felt a strange feeling come over him. Not pride, but rather a warm realization that his simple act mattered. She loved a good story, Mr. Harper continued. I guess that's why we got along so well. She always said that the real value wasn't in things, but in people, and you proved that today. The teenager looked at Mr. Harper with unexpected respect. I think she was right. Cherish that quality, Desmond, the old man said, looking at him carefully. The world is changing, but kindness is still needed, even if it is not immediately recognized. Desmond remained silent, but inside he felt that those words would stay with him for a long time. Well, I won't keep you any longer, Mr. Harper said at last, turning back to the car. Thanks again for your help. You're welcome, Mr. Harper, the teenager replied, smiling slightly. Good luck with your books. The car started, and Mr. Harper waved to him before driving away, but Desmond stood still for a few seconds, staring after the car. It seemed that this brief conversation at the trunk had changed something inside him, not globally, but importantly. He put his headphones back on and went on with his route, feeling somehow different. After all, sometimes even the briefest of encounters can leave a deep mark. On the way home, Desmond felt unusually light. The morning sun shone through the tree branches, playing light on the pavement, and the cool breeze pleasantly refreshed his face. The music he had on in his headphones played in the background, but his thoughts were far from the rhythm of the tracks. He replayed a conversation with Mr. Harper over and over in his mind. Those words about kindness, about books that were dear to the old man's wife, echoed in his mind. It was more than just helping with the box. He felt that he had done something meaningful, even if he could not fully explain it himself. Walking down a familiar street with white picket fences and manicured lawns, he remembered how his grandmother often said, kindness isn't something you have to show off. It's something you do when no one is looking. Back then, as a younger man, he hadn't quite understood her words, but now, looking at the passers-by, he thought, isn't that the point? He was reminded of the people who walked past Mr. Harper. Many simply looked away. Some quickened their steps, pretending not to notice. It didn't mean they were bad, but Desmond suddenly realized how easy it was to become part of the crowd that turned a blind eye. When he reached his house, he was greeted by a familiar sight, a wooden staircase with slightly creaky steps, an old mailbox with peeling paint, and the garden that his father had always kept in order. It all seemed so familiar, so ordinary, but today there was a special beauty to it. Desmond stopped at the door, took off his headphones, and paused a moment to catch his breath. He didn't need a thank you, or any special thanks from Mr. Harper. What mattered was something else. The realization that he had done what needed to be done. He went inside. From the kitchen came the smell of toasting toast and the creak of the old radio his father listened to every morning. Are you back already? Came his father's voice. He was standing by the stove, watching his son with a slight smile. "Yeah, ran around a bit," Desmond replied, nodding and making his way to his room. Closing the door behind him, he threw himself on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. Strange thoughts swirled in his head. Why do people help each other at all? What makes them do it? Why was it so easy for him to stop and help, but not for others? Desmond remembered Mr. Harper talking about his wife, about the books she had loved so much. There was a warm sadness in those words, but something else, too. Gratitude for the memory, for preserving something important. And then he realized that kindness is not about receiving gratitude. It's about creating it. It's about giving a part of yourself, knowing that you're making the world a little better. He stood up, went to the window, and looked out. The street was empty, and only the wind moved the leaves on the trees. At that moment, he suddenly thought that the world would never be perfect. But that didn't mean we shouldn't try. Perhaps Mr. Harper will forget him. Perhaps there will never be another meeting. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that now, in this moment, Desmond felt part of something bigger. He felt a little warmer in his heart. He decided that he would help whenever he could, not because he expected something in return, but because it was the right thing to do. But he had no idea that this simple act had already set in motion a chain of events that would turn his life upside down. The next day, the morning began as it always did. The sunlight was lazily streaming through the curtains, filling Desmond's room with soft light. He yawned, stretched, and, glancing at the alarm clock, realized he could have slept a little longer. But something made him rise from the bed, a vague sensation, as if something unusual hung in the air, kept him from lying still. "I should be used to mornings by now," he muttered to himself as he headed for the window. What he saw made him stop. In front of his house stood an elegant black car. It was clearly an expensive car, perfectly clean, with tinted windows that seemed to hide its occupants. Desmond frowned. "What kind of spy movie is this?" he muttered. The teenager quickly pulled on a t-shirt, slipped on his sneakers, and walked down the stairs to the porch. The car stood still, as if watching him, though, of course, that was impossible. Just as he was about to return to the house, the driver's door opened. A man in a strict suit with a perfectly ironed tie stepped out of the car. He looked serious, but friendly. "Is this Desmond's house?" the man asked, turning to the teenager. Yeah, it's me. What's up?" The man smiled slightly, as if he was pleasantly surprised by the teenager's confidence. "I have something for you," he said, stepping closer. Desmond took a step back, frowning even more. "For me? Is this a joke?" The man, oblivious to his suspicions, walked back to the car, opened the back door, and pulled something wrapped in the brown paper and tied with ribbon from the interior. "Mr. Harper asked me to give this to you," he said, holding out the package. Desmond stared at the bundle for a moment before taking it carefully. The ribbons were tight, but he untied them easily, revealing an old book with a ragged leather cover. "What is this?" he asked, looking at the man. "It was one of his wife's favorite books," he explained. "He said he saw you as someone who could really appreciate that kind of thing." Desmond ran his fingers over the cover. Feeling the rough texture of the leather, it was a strange feeling, a mixture of excitement and something else, something deeper. "I just helped him with the box," he said, trying to find the words. "I didn't do it for... he knows," the man said softly. And that's why he wanted to thank you." Desmond fell silent. He wanted to say that he shouldn't, that it was too much, but something inside told him that this book was important, not only to Mr. Harper, but to himself. "Is that it?" he finally asked, feeling the words stick in his throat. The man smiled, heading back to the car. "Maybe this is just the beginning," he said before getting behind the wheel. The car started, and a moment later disappeared around the corner, leaving Desmond alone on the porch with a book in his hands. He sat down on the steps and opened it. There was neat handwriting on the first page. This book is not just a story. It's a reminder that good things always come back. Desmond stared at those words for a long moment before turning the page. He sensed that there was more ahead of him than he could have imagined. The words in the book stayed in Desmond's head. He flipped through the pages, feeling that he was holding more than just an old volume. But every sentence, every line seemed to whisper, "Wait, time will explain everything." He closed the book and looked up. The street was empty, and the morning calm was back in the house. And yet, something had changed. Somehow it felt as if the world had shifted slightly, as if someone had left him a message he was only beginning to understand. It would seem that this could have been the end of it. But a few hours later, when he had already returned to his daily routine, the black car reappeared in front of his house. This time, Desmond rushed straight to the door, not even trying to restrain his curiosity. He stepped out onto the porch, not waiting for someone in the car to make the first move. "You again?" he asked, looking at the driver, who, as in the morning, looked impeccable. The man in the suit got out of the car again, but this time he was holding a small, neat case made of old wood with a golden clasp. "This is for you, too," he said, holding out the case to Desmond. Oh, the teenager took it gingerly, feeling his pulse quicken. "What's that?" "Open it and see," the man replied briefly, smiling again as if he knew something more. Desmond, trembling with curiosity and slight excitement, slowly opened the clasp. Inside lay a folded sheet of paper and a small pocket compass, which, from its appearance, was older than Mr. Harper himself. "A compass?" the teenager muttered in surprise, picking it up. The driver nodded. "This compass has been with Mr. Harper his whole life. He said you should have it now." Desmond frowned, looking at the driver incomprehensibly. "Why? I barely know him." The man leaned a little closer with a serious but still friendly expression. "Sometimes we meet people who remind us of the way we were, or what we wish we were." Desmond didn't know what to say. He silently opened the folded sheet of paper. Mr. Harper's handwriting was neat, almost calligraphic. "Desmond, this compass has helped me find my way in my most difficult moments. But the true path is always within us. You have shown that there is still kindness in the world. It is a sign that even simple acts can be the beginning of something great. Take care of it, and remember, wherever you go, follow what your heart tells you." Desmond's eyes ran over the lines several times. Each word sounded like the quiet voice of an old man, full of wisdom and warmth. "It's unbelievable," he finally exhaled, looking up at the man. "Why did he do that?" The driver only shrugged his shoulders. "He saw something special in you. Maybe kindness, maybe a spark." Desmond twirled the compass thoughtfully in his hands. The hand seemed to move a little smoother than on ordinary instruments, as if it were guided not by geography, but by something deeper. "I don't know what to say," he admitted honestly. "You don't have to say anything," the man said, heading toward the car again. "Just go on your way." When the car drove away, leaving behind only the quiet sound of tires on asphalt, Desmond was still standing on the porch, holding on to the briefcase and compass. He opened the note again, rereading Mr. Harper's words. Somehow there was a sense not only of gratitude in them, but of some kind of assignment. Not literally, of course, but he felt that with this gift came a responsibility that was far greater than he could have imagined. "A compass that leads after the heart," he muttered, twirling it in his hands. He had a sudden urge to check it. Maybe it was foolish, but he turned, holding the compass in front of him, and took a few steps forward. The arrow didn't waver, but it pointed in a definite direction, not north, but somewhere slightly to the left. Where did it go? And what was Mr. Harper trying to say? This was only the beginning of a mystery that Desmond felt would change his life. Desmond stood on the porch for a long time, clutching the antique compass in his hand. Its silver surface caught the sun's rays, and the arrow swayed slowly, as if it were choosing its own direction. Mr. Harper's gift was both surprising and puzzling. Why had the old man chosen to give him such a personal item? What had he done to deserve it? He went back into the house, threw the briefcase on the table, and unfolded the note again. The words, "Follow what your heart tells you," stuck in his mind. They sounded like a quiet reminder that life is not only a road, but also the choices you make at every crossroads. Sitting down on the bed, he thought, his act of kindness, which had seemed so simple and ordinary, had suddenly turned into something much more. It wasn't just helping an elderly person. It was the beginning of a chain, the consequences of which he was only beginning to realize. What is kindness? He asked himself. He remembered the moment he saw Mr. Harper struggling with the heavy box. He could have walked past, as so many people did. He had no obligation. No one was forcing him to stop. And yet he did it, not because he wanted anything in return, but simply because he felt like it. Now there was another question before him. Why had Mr. Harper chosen to thank him? What did he see in him? Desmond picked up the compass and examined it closely. It was old, but well kept. Engraved on the lid were the initials, J.H., obviously James Harper. But inside, under the arrow, was another inscription, barely visible but clearly legible. The true way is in the heart. He ran his finger over the engraving. What did it mean? Was it just a pretty phrase? Or was Mr. Harper trying to tell him something more? New thoughts began to come into his head. Desmond realized that this generosity wasn't just an act of gratitude, it was a lesson. Mr. Harper had shown him that kindness comes back, though not always in the way you expect. The teenager recalled his grandmother's words, "Every deed you do leaves a mark, and that mark may be bigger than you realize." Maybe my help left a mark on Mr. Harper's life, he thought, but his answer has left a mark on mine. He began to wonder how many times he himself had walked past people in need of help. How many opportunities to change someone's day, or maybe even their life, had he missed? But now he knew. It didn't always require something grandiose. Sometimes a simple stop, a handshake, or even a smile was enough. It takes no effort, but it can mean everything to the person on the other side. Kindness isn't a transaction where you expect something in return, he thought. It's a choice you make for others, even if no one sees it. It became clear to him that this incident had changed his perception. He no longer saw acts of kindness as mundane. They were sparks that could light a fire in someone else's heart. The world began to seem different. Now he saw it not just as a place where everyone lived their own lives, but as a network of invisible connections. One person's small actions could lead to big changes in another person's life. And it all started with one heavy box. Desmond got up and went outside. The sunlight was bright, the air warm. He looked at the compass again. The arrow pointed north, but he felt that the instrument did more than just show direction. He wondered if Mr. Harper had chosen to give him something so personal. Could it be that it was a message? A call to seek something more in life than just routine and habits? "You wanted me to follow my heart," Desmond said quietly, looking at the compass. And at that moment he realized that his heart always tells him where to go. You just have to learn to listen. That day became a point of reference for him. Mr. Harper's generosity didn't just surprise him. It made him want to be better, not for the reward, but because it was the right thing to do. Kindness is power, he thought, clutching the compass in his hand. It changes not only those you help, but also yourself. Desmond felt that his life would never be the same. Now he wanted to be the spark that lit a fire in others, because sometimes one simple act can change the whole world. It had been several days since Desmond had received the old compass and the mysterious note from Mr. Harper. The compass lay on his desk, but the teenager couldn't stop thinking that there was something more behind the gift. Questions about the old man's life and his strange but profound gratitude kept him busy. One day, after school, Desmond, plucking up courage, decided to find out for himself where Mr. Harper lived. He remembered that the old man had mentioned a library and assumed that he could be found somewhere near there. He started at the small local library where a box of books had just been delivered. When Desmond stepped inside, he was greeted by the smell of old paper and silence, broken only by the rustle of pages. "What can I do for you?" the elderly librarian asked, noticing his confused look. "Hello," he began. "I'm looking for Mr. Harper. He recently delivered some books here." "Ah, James Harper," the woman replied softly, smiling. "Yes, he did leave us a whole collection. Beautiful specimens, but why do you want it?" "Well, Desmond hesitated for a moment, not knowing how to explain. "He gave me something important, and I'd like to talk to him." The librarian nodded, as if realizing that the young man was speaking sincerely. "He lives nearby, on the corner of 3rd and Pine. Gray house with a porch. I think he'd be glad to see you." Desmond reached the address a few minutes later. The house, indeed, turned out to be small and old, with wooden steps leading up to a cozy porch. The teenager sighed before knocking on the door. The door opened almost immediately, as if Mr. Harper had been expecting him. "Desmond," the old man said, smiling, "I knew you'd come sooner or later." "Really?" wondered the teenager. "Of course," Mr. Harper replied, gesturing for him to come inside. The house was just as Desmond had expected, warm and cozy. There was an old gramophone in the corner, and the walls were hung with pictures. In one of them he saw a young man in a military uniform. "Is that you?" Desmond asked, pointing to the picture. Mr. Harper nodded, looking thoughtfully at the photograph. "Yes, I was 20. It was a different time," he said, sinking into his memories. They sat down at a small table in the kitchen, and the old man poured them tea. You know, Desmond, when I saw you that day, you reminded me of myself. Young, hopeful, willing to help, without asking why. Desmond felt a slight embarrassment. Did you? But I didn't do anything special. Mr. Harper smiled. You think it is. But one day you will realize that the most important things are not the great deeds, but the small deeds we do for others. He took a sip of tea and continued, when I was young, I used to do the same thing, but life, he paused for a moment, as if searching for words is not always simple. Desmond nodded, sensing he was about to hear something important. My wife, Emma, Mr. Harper began, his voice softer. She was the kindest person I ever knew. We met after the war. I came home broken, having lost many friends. But she gave me back my faith in people. Desmond noticed the old man's eyes moisten slightly, but he kept talking. She loved books. They were her world. Every night she read to me, even when I was too tired or didn't want to listen. Her voice soothed me, reminded me that there was more to life than pain and loss. Mr. Harper looked up at Desmond. When she died, it was like the whole world stopped, but I decided that her love of books should live on. That's why I gave them to the library. Desmond nodded slowly, feeling something pinch inside. And this compass, continued Mr. Harper, was her present to me on our wedding day. She said, James, may it always remind you that the true path is the one you choose with your heart. He held out his hand as if he held that compass again. I didn't use it often, but it was always with me. When I saw how you helped me that day, I knew you had to have it. But, Desmond began, feeling the words stick in his throat. Why me? Mr. Harper smiled. His face lit up with warmth. Because you have a good heart. You've done something that a lot of people would think is unimportant. And I want you to know that doing something like that changes the world. Desmond looked at the compass, which now seemed even more significant. Thank you, he said quietly, sincerely. Mr. Harper nodded, as if his mission was accomplished. Always follow your heart, Desmond. It will never let you down. This encounter stayed with Desmond forever, as a reminder that in the simplest people and actions, the greatest stories are hidden. After his conversation with Mr. Harper, Desmond returned home in deep thought. Every step he took seemed to be soaked with thoughts of what he had just heard. The old man's story had not merely touched him, it had left an indelible mark on his mind. He couldn't forget the way Mr. Harper had talked about his wife, about books, about how the compass had helped him in difficult times. It all seemed at once simple and deeply meaningful. The compass in Desmond's pocket was no longer just a thing. It had become a symbol that bound them together. When he went into his room, the first thing he did was take out his compass and put it on the table. The arrow still swayed quietly, but now it seemed to him to be more than just a directional indicator. How does it work? Desmond thought. Why is it that one little thing, one random moment, can change everything? He suddenly remembered the day he had first seen Mr. Harper with the box. At the time, it had seemed like a simple decision to come over and help. But now, he realized it had been more than a gesture. It was a moment that had connected their lives and made them see the world differently. Desmond decided to go outside to get some air. He walked down the familiar road he traveled every day, but today it seemed different. The passers-by, who had been just a faceless mass, were now interesting to him. They each have a story to tell, he thought. What secrets do they keep? How can one act of kindness change their lives? As he passed a neighbor's house, he noticed an elderly woman, Mrs. Green, trying to reach the branches of an apple tree. Her basket was almost empty, and there were many more juicy apples hanging from the branches. Desmond stopped. Not long ago, he might have just walked on by, thinking it was none of his business, but now he realized that even the smallest actions mattered. "Mrs. Green, can I help you?" he asked, stepping closer. The woman looked up, slightly surprised, but then smiled. "Oh, that would be wonderful, dear. These apples are so stubborn." Desmond took the basket and reached out and began plucking fruit from the top branches. "You know," he said, handing her a full basket, "you should get someone to help you with the stairs or something." Mrs. Green laughed. "It's not easy to find help these days. People are too busy to notice such small things." Desmond nodded, her words echoing in his head. He knew what she was talking about, and he felt that something could be changed. The next day, inspired by this moment, he came up with an idea. He decided to create a small chain of kindness in his neighborhood. To start small, offer neighbors help with their chores, and then ask them to pass it on to others. It seemed silly to him at first. Who needs it? He thought. But the more he pondered, the more his conviction grew. The first person he decided to tell about it was his best friend, Marcus. "Do you want to do good deeds?" Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. "Well, yes," Desmond replied. "I just think it might make a difference." "Are you serious? That sounds cool, but weird." "Weird, maybe. But you know, I helped an old man with a box the other day, and it changed everything. It's a long story, but Marcus, it works." Marcus looked at him, clearly surprised at such enthusiasm. "Okay, I'm with you," he said finally, smiling. "Let's see where this goes." Over the next few weeks, they started small. They helped their neighbors with groceries, cleaned their driveways of fallen leaves, and had small meetings to discuss how everyone could contribute. To their surprise, the idea began to grow. People who had previously barely nodded at each other on the street now stopped to talk. Someone offered to help repair the fence. Someone offered to organize a park cleanup. One evening, Desmond was sitting in his room, holding Mr. Harper's compass in his hand. He watched the hand slowly oscillate and suddenly realized that it was always pointing not only to the north, but also to the target he had found. A small act can change everything, he thought. The world may be huge, but it's kindness that brings it closer. Mr. Harper was right. Kindness does bring the world together, not because it's a big, loud thing, but because it's connected to the heart. And when you follow your heart, you find your true path. It had been several weeks since Mr. Harper, the compass, and the realization that one act could change the whole world had come into Desmond's life. The neighborhood in which he lived was beginning to change, not immediately, but perceptibly. People who had barely known each other before began to socialize, offering help and support. Smiles on the streets became more frequent, and mutual participation was no longer a rarity. For Desmond, it wasn't just a pleasant observation, it had become his new goal. But he knew it wasn't enough. If I've been able to inspire a few people, he thought, as he sat at his desk and looked at the compass, what more can I do if I start acting on a larger scale? An idea came to him, and this time it was much more ambitious. In the evening, he gathered his friends, Marcus, Sarah, and Ava at the old playground where they often hung out in junior high school. He was holding a notebook full of notes and ideas. "Okay, folks, I have a plan," he began, unfolding a notepad in his lap. "And what do you mean?" Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow. "About the new park cleanup?" "No," he replied, smiling slightly. "We're moving on. I want to make our chain of goodness bigger, not just here, but everywhere." Marcus grinned. "You want to start a kindness revolution?" "Exactly," Desmond replied gravely. "Why not?" "Look, we're already seeing it work. People are getting closer. We can create a network of sorts where everyone can help someone else and then pass it on." Ava looked at him thoughtfully. "You want people to share kindness like a virus?" "Yes," Desmond cheered. "But it will be a virus that unites rather than destroys." "And how do you envision that?" Sarah asked, squinting skeptically. Desmond opened his notebook and showed his sketches. "We will start with small tasks. First in our neighborhood, helping the elderly, free classes for children, collecting clothes for the needy. But I want this to grow. People need to see that they are not alone, that everyone can be part of something bigger." The idea was ambitious, almost impossible, but Desmond spoke with such enthusiasm that all of three friends felt it could work. "Okay," Marcus finally said. "This sounds crazy, but I'm with you." "Me too," Ava added, smiling. "I think we can do something cool." Sarah rolled her eyes, but her voice sounded warm. "All right, fine. But if that doesn't work, you'll have to personally pick up any leftover leaves in our yard." The idea began to take shape. They created a small group called the Chain of Goodness and started with simple things. They printed out flyers explaining the idea. Everyone who received help should pass it on by helping someone else. To their surprise, people were quick to pick up on the idea. One evening, Desmond saw one of his neighbors, Mr. Reeves, helping to fix a bicycle for a boy from next door. This boy then came to Desmond's grandmother and offered to help with the garden. Soon, everyone around him began to notice how small gestures add up to a big chain. The project started to gain momentum. Local newspapers wrote about how the teenagers had changed the atmosphere in their neighborhood. People from other parts of the city began to wonder how they could join in. All of this was inspiring to Desmond, but he didn't forget where it all began. One evening, as he was helping to collect items for charity, Mr. Harper approached his house. "I heard you started here," he said, smiling slightly. Did you see it?" Desmond wondered. "Yeah, and I'm proud of you." Mr. Harper took a small photograph out of his pocket and held it out to Desmond. "That's my wife, Emma," he said. "She'd be proud of you. She always believed that kindness could bring people together." Desmond looked at the photograph. It showed a woman with kind eyes and a soft smile that seemed to glow with warmth. "Thank you, Mr. Harper," he said quietly. "No, son, thank you. You proved her right." A few more months passed. Desmond's idea spread to neighboring neighborhoods and then beyond. People began sharing their stories on social media, telling how they were inspired by a simple chain of kindness. But for Desmond, it wasn't about fame. It was about people, about the bonds they made by helping each other. Every time he looked at the compass, he remembered Mr. Harper's words, "Follow your heart." He knew now that this journey was just beginning. Kindness really can unite the world. You just have to start with yourself. This story teaches that even the simplest and smallest acts of kindness can change lives, not only of the one being helped, but also of the one being helped. It shows that kindness is a force that can bring people together, break down barriers, and create a chain of change that encompasses the whole world. The story reminds us of the importance of being considerate of others. Sometimes all it takes is one sincere gesture to inspire someone to return kindness and start a chain of positive change. It emphasizes true kindness is selfless, does not require gratitude or seek recognition, but comes from the heart. The protagonist, starting with a simple act of helping, discovers that the world is full of hidden connections. He realizes that each of us has the opportunity to influence those around us, to make their lives easier, brighter, and better. It is important not to be afraid to be the first to lend a hand, because goodness always returns, even if not immediately. The story also shows how important it is to remain sincere despite the indifference or skepticism of others. It inspires us to act not for the sake of reward, but for the sake of making the world at least a little kinder. This is the true meaning of humanity, finding your place in the world through caring for others. Friends, what do you think of this story? Did you like how one simple action could change not only the life of the hero, but also the life of an entire community? Write in the comments what you think about this story, what it means to you, and how you perceive the power of kindness. Also, tell us about your acts of kindness. You may have helped a stranger, supported a friend in a difficult moment, or simply done something good for another person. Your stories are inspiring, and we are sure that they can become the beginning of a new chain of kindness. Let's together create a space where good wins